Hello, everyone. Welcome to the panel. Unfortunately, we're running a bit late. We still have a few speakers who are going to join soon. I hope you can wait a bit and thank you for your patience. And I'm really sorry for this inconvenience, but we shall be starting soon. Maybe we can start talking in the chat already.
So who else are we waiting for?
We're waiting for our remaining three panelists, Richard Henderson, Christina Hassa, and Carissa Sanbon Matsu. So we're hoping they join soon. We're kind of trying to get in touch with them over email. Sorry for the delay. Okay, Christina Hassa is here. We should see her on screen soon. We'll wait for 3 to 4 minutes, and if everyone else doesn't join. Okay, Richard Henderson is also here, and we start in 2 minutes then. Sorry for the delay, everyone. Hi, Christina Hassa is having connection problems. Did you check your connection, Christina? Is your Chrome updated? Maybe you have to enable your mic before you enter the webinar. Maybe you could try joining again.
Let's refresh the page.
You could also try refreshing the page. No problem. Okay, we hope Christina joins us soon. Hello, Professor Henderson. I already talked to Erica and Richard about this. Would you be okay with us recording this session so
Yeah,
that
no,
it can be
fine.
available on? And would
Yeah.
it be okay if we put it on our YouTube channel?
For the what was that question, that last one?
Would it be okay if we publish it on our YouTube channel?
Oh, yes. No problem.
Great, thank you. We should start soon. I hope Christina can join us again.
So how
And-
many people are there all together in this panel discussion?
So we're three moderators from the Horizons team, and we have 5 panelists. It's Dr. Erica Sugar, Dr. Richard Sever, you,
Yeah.
Dr. Carissa Sanbon-Matsu, and Dr. Christina Hassan.
Yeah. I think that the problem may be that obviously if they're already trying to connect, but when I tried to connect, I looked at the website with all the link pages on it,
Yeah.
and the one with the panel, it was the main page with the links for all the talks, and then the panel was kind of cut off. So eventually
okay.
I realized it was off to the side, brought it back on, and that link worked. But it took
Oh,
me 2
okay.
or 3 minutes. So.
Oh, okay. Yeah. She was able to join. I think her mic has an issue, so maybe
That's a
rejoining might
different
help.
problem, yeah.
Yeah. We hope it works out soon. Sorry for the delay, everyone, and also everyone in the audience.
Yeah, that's sitting like yeah, she's back.
Okay, she's back. Hope we can see her soon.
So are there any other people listening yet, or is it not yet open to the participants?
So we are basically live. So we have 58 people in attendee list who are now together with us. So they're already listening
Great.
and waiting for our discussion. So probably the solution for the Christina would be to try different, to change the devices in the camera options. So on the top right there is the microphone and the camera settings. And the settings try to change devices. Sometimes the default device is different from the actual working one. So try to change this.
Hello, everyone. Sorry for the delay. I hope Christina can join us soon, but maybe we can go ahead and start already. So, welcome to the panel discussion for Horizons. As part of the conference, we organized this session to talk to our speakers about relevant issues in the scientific field, get to know what their thoughts are about it, and shed light on different aspects of the topic. This year, our panel discussion is titled Science Subscription to Sensation. The publication of peer-reviewed research in scientific journals is how we communicate and share our science. The process of publishing a scientific study, from submission to peer review to the final acceptance of the article, is an opaque process riddled with bias. We're living in an era where you can share anything with the world at the click of a button, but publishing a paper can take up to a year. This is mainly due to a back and forth between the editors and reviewers and the authors. But how much value does peer review add to a manuscript? And despite such a stringent review, why is the scientific community facing a replication crisis? We have seen a surge of preprint servers that circumvent the peer review process and make scientific literature easily publishable and accessible. However, would grant commissions, tenure committees, and the scientific community at large view a preprint at par with peer-reviewed research? Why do we give so much importance to impact factors, and are they a reliable measure to judge the quality of a publication? Despite the rise of open access journals and preprint servers, a large chunk of scientific literature is locked behind paywalls, making access to science a privilege. How do we make systemic changes to make science and open access sustainable? How would this play out in developing nations? And finally, can all science be made open access, and would journals become obsolete someday? These are a few questions we would like to discuss today. Providing us more insight into the domain of scientific publishing is our incredible panel. We have with us today Dr. Christina Hasse, who seems to have some issues right now, but we hope she joins us soon. She's a group leader at EMBL working on the development of in vitro assays for the examination of vascular diseases. You'll be hearing more about this in her talk tomorrow. Joining us from the MRC LMB in Cambridge is Professor Richard Henderson. He was awarded the Nobel Prize for Chemistry in 2017 for his pioneering work on the electron crystallography of membrane proteins, something we all learned a lot about from his great talk today. We also have Dr. Carissa Sandin Matsu, sorry. She isn't here yet, but we hope she joins us soon. We have from the Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory, Dr. Richard Sever. He is the founder of Preprint Server BioArchive, which he spoke about in his insightful talk yesterday as part of the Career Fair. Last but not the least, we have Dr. Erica Sugart, the Executive Director of the American Society for Cell Biology. She has had an illustrious career in the field of scientific communication and provided us a lot of interesting ideas for a career in scientific engagement with her talk yesterday. I would like to thank all of you for taking the time out for this discussion, and we're really looking forward to having an interesting and insightful discussion. The structure of today's discussion is such that we shall have three broad sessions of 30 minutes each, with 20 minutes of discussion on some questions prepared by the Horizons team, followed by 10 minutes of Q&A, where we put up questions by the audience. Please write your questions in the Q&A and upload the questions you would like to see answered. In case you would like to direct your question to a specific speaker, please also mention that with the question. With this, I would like to ask Barbara to take over and kick us off.
All right, thank you, Meher, for the nice introduction. And I will be moderating the first part of the session, where I would like to discuss problems connected to publication bias and the peer review process. So publication bias generally occurs when the probability that a result is published depends on the result itself. So therefore, my first question to the panel is, do you feel that producing a positive result is valued more than the quality of the design and the execution of a study? Whoever wants to make the start, please feel free. So perhaps I can ask Professor.
Well, you sound like it started with like a, not any softball questions on this panel, that's for sure.
Well,
if you want me to repeat the question.
I think one point one should think about is to whom does this matter? Because I think the notion of publication bias is often comes up, and I think you need to think about who we're thinking about. Where is the bias taking place? One of the things that I hear time and time again is people say, "Oh, I want to publish this reproducibility study, but the journal isn't interested. The journals aren't interested. I can't publish it. And I think you need to look really deep at the root cause of the problem here, because the reality is that you will find that you'll find a journal that will publish anything. There are predatory journals out there which will literally publish anything, and then there's a kind of essentially a hierarchy of journals. So it's not a case that these things can't be published. It's the case that there are certain venues that people want to publish in, and they have criteria for novelty, for example. So you know, just because Nature won't publish a paper doesn't mean that PLOS won't publish it. Or, you know, in our case on bioRxiv, we make no selection for novelty whatsoever. So I think there's a number of factors at play here. And one of them is there's a self-selection going on, because people want to publish things that they feel are going to be novel and will advance their careers. And there's a kind of the scientific publication system is set up to reflect this. So I think it's important to think about that aspect. I mean, I'm really kind of interested to hear from somebody like Richard, who's an active scientist, about, you know, the extent to which, you know, I'm sure Richard has done tens of thousands of experiments in his life, but there will be a subset of those that he has chosen to publish, and there's a reason for that. Some of them because you have more faith in them, but some of them you feel advance the field. And for a young investigator, there will be again a self-selection because they feel that there will be things that will advance their career. So I think when we talk about publication bias, there's a temptation to think that this sits in one place, you know, in the mind of a journal editor, but it's really more of a sort of systemic issue to do with the way science advances and the way in which scientific careers advance.
Yeah, so maybe would you like me to say something next? Is it Barbara? You're the chair of this part. So when I read, yeah, thanks. When I read the idea of having the panel discussion, and one of the topics being overcoming publication bias, of course, I didn't quite know what that meant. So my assumption was that publication bias maybe was that people chose which journal to submit to, not necessarily because it was the one that would give them good refereeing or would reach an audience that had a common interest, which might be a specialist journal, but they might want to publish in a journal that had the maximum circulation, or they wanted to choose a journal because it had a high impact factor. So in other words, they want to publish because of the name of the journal. And indeed, a lot of recruitment exercises or promotion exercises, the people on the committees just don't have the time to read the papers properly. They just look at the list and tick off. And I remember one anecdote, which was, how did you get a habilitation, which was a peculiar degree that allowed you to be promoted to be a professor in Germany or Austria or so on. And one joke was that in Vienna, in one institution, the criteria for getting a habilitation wasn't to write something that was full of information, but you simply added up the impact factor of every journal in which you'd published a paper. So I then looked up impact factors of journal, and I found, and the answer, if that sum was more than 50, you got your habilitation. That was the idea. So I looked up the impact factors that year, and Annual Review of Biochemistry had an impact factor of 64. So in Austria, to get a habilitation that year, all you needed was one review published in the Annual Review of Biochemistry. So in other words, they delegated their duty to do quality control for their professors to the editors who were inviting reviews for the Annual Review of Biochemistry. So it was complete nonsense, actually. So anyway, that was one of my takes. So I've never been particularly keen on nature or science myself. I think it's more important to give an emphasis to the content of the paper, even though it's published in a relatively obscure journal. So if I look at my publication list, there's probably 4 or 5 papers that were published in Nature, and we chose to submit them there because we thought they had a wide impact and that the audience would be interested in it. But most of them are in relatively obscure journals. For example, ultramicroscopy. I once told Steve Harrison, a well-known structural biologist from Harvard, he said, "Where do you publish all your papers?" And I said, "Oh, we do a lot in ultramicroscopy." He said, "Never heard of it." So, it's up to people to decide exactly what they want. But anyway, then coming to your question, does the probability of publication depend on the quality of the result? I would say different journals have different philosophies. So they're not all homogeneous in why they're publishing. Some of them are publishing to make money. Some of them are society journals that are trying to enrich their subject and get the best papers to be published in their journal. So I think it might well be that you'll get more insight into this by asking for lists of people's anecdotes about what is their experience in terms of publication bias. So just to end my little contribution, I have two little anecdotes. So one of them, we had a paper on a relatively technical matter, which was how do water molecules in amorphous ice move around when you put the electron beam on them? Now, this is very physics oriented, is very technical. And the people I was working with said, "Oh, no. They said, we must submit it to PNAS. So this is a big American journal, National Academy and so on. And we said, this is a very important paper. Everyone needs to know about it outside our own field. So we submitted it and got our two referees' comments back from PNAS. They both said, this is a wonderful paper, excellent work, good results, and so on. However, one of the criteria of PNAS is, does it have general interest outside the area, or is it better in a more specialized journal? And both of the referees ticked the better in a more specialized journal, and therefore the editor said, okay, your paper, brilliant though it is, which we thought it was, is now rejected. And so I said, okay, well, now we can submit it to ultramicroscopy, which is what I'd suggested in the first place. And they said, oh, no, we must appeal. Okay, so we appealed, and I wrote a long letter relating radiation damage to water to cancer, which, of course, is a bit of a joke. It's not directly related, but you do get radiation damage and cancerous mutations, so on and so on. Anyway, they sent it out to be reviewed, and it was rejected a second time. So we published it in ultramicroscopy, where it's got hundreds of, it's a good paper. And then my other one was in another case with different authors. We had a paper which I said, oh, let's put it into Journal of Molecular Biology, which is a very staid, rigorous, good refereeing. The paper is often greatly improved by being submitted there and being refereed there. But my co-author said, no, we must try Nature. So I said, fine, let's try Nature. Okay, so sent it to Nature, and we got 2 or 3 reviews back saying this is excellent work, but we've got these various nitpicking remarks, which are the ones that often take a year to resolve. And they said, okay, well, normally we would give you time to respond to these criticisms, but we have 2 other papers that have already been submitted on a similar topic, which are urgent and must be published. Therefore, yours is rejected. So I said to my co-author, I said, okay, well, we must appeal this actual day, less than 12 hours to respond. Otherwise, their idea that they have to rush to publish. So we wrote a long rebuttal. And because the editor had disclosed they had 2 other papers, we put into the rebuttal, if you go ahead and publish those 2 papers by other authors and reject our paper, then in historical terms, you will have published the 2 wrong papers and the right result will be published. So the same day they accepted it. So, you mustn't. So I think the general idea is you have to go in there with your elbows out, argue, listen to what they're saying, what is their philosophy, and then basically it's a game. Publishing is a game, and there are rules, and everybody's got different rules. So you have to kind of distill all that wisdom, suck in all that knowledge, and then use it to your advantage if that's what one of your goals is. Anyway, those are some thoughts.
Thank you very much for these anecdotes. I think we all enjoyed listening to you. So actually, my next question to you would have been whether you think that journals or researchers themselves create publication bias. But I think both Richards have kind of given us the opinion already that it's rather with the scientists where the problem lies. So would the other panelists agree as well?
I mean, I think so. I mean, I think that the scientific community is sometimes its own worst enemy on this. There's a lot of desire to get, away from bias when we talk about in all sorts of areas, not only in publication, but when we talk about hiring and fellowships. But then the truth of the matter is it's the scientists that often make the decisions about who's going to get in. And I think in the journal part, we're talking about the, peer review has two parts. It's sort of like there's the review part that's looking at the accuracy, looking at all those kind of, has the story complete? And then there's sort of the curatorial side that's sort of like, is this a good match for the journal? We have a journal at ASCB, Molecular Biology of the Cell, and our bar is like, is it new and is it true? We're not, there are other journals that are looking for quote unquote, kind of hot topics and things like that. So different journals curate for different reasons and they package that stuff together. And I think that's the place that maybe some of the publication bias kind of comes in. And I think the question is when you're looking to publish your story, as Dr. Henderson was saying, lots of times the specialist journals are really a great place to be because it's going to get out to the field. But people often want, certainly in the field I'm in, cell biology, people want that, cell science Nature. They're looking for one of those because it's viewed as being a better journal, but really they're broader journals. They have a different purpose. And I think that is something that comes out of the scientific community. And it's a lot because, the publication is driven because it's driven by the assessment of the careers. It's driven by whether you're going to get money, whether you're going to get a promotion. Those are very important sort of, life-altering events. And when that's tied up in publication, it then causes people to really want to go for like a certain effect in the journal. So I think that whole sort of Gordian knot that we have with research assessment tied up in the publication assessment and the careers does create, real challenges when we're looking at this. And it is a lot the scientific community that's driving that. It's not a thing entirely, but I think there's some of that.
I just wanted to clarify something and completely endorse what Erica said. I think when I wouldn't want to give the impression that I was saying that scientists were at fault for this. I think the point is that it's the scientists' actions, but they're a response to the environment and exactly the environment Eric is talking about. And I think there's some critical data here which indicate how acute the problem has become. Because it's all about getting a job, getting tenure, getting promotion, and we have sadly fairly limited metrics are used, hence the obsession with impact factor. And the reason people care about this is because the pyramid has become so much more narrow in science. If you look at the number of PhD students that are trained now, there's basically only about 1 in 13 of them would have a potential faculty job, because the number of PhD students has increased massively in the past few decades, whereas the number of faculty positions has remained pretty constant. So I often hear people say, oh, in my day, we didn't used to worry about where we should publish something. We didn't care about the journal. And my response is, well, that's because in those days, if you did a decent postdoc, you could get a tenure position. Most people were able to do that. Whereas now, it's become so much more now, the competition is so much more intense because the number of faculty positions has not mirrored the increase in the number of PhD students, that there's, people are desperate to find something that makes them stick out, and that may be a high impact journal publication, and that's when people begin to worry about publication bias, because everybody is skewed towards something that will make them stick out, not the kind of solid, well done research that Richard was describing.
I think everything's been covered, so I won't belabor the point.
Okay, welcome to the panel as well, Christina. Thank you for joining, and it's great that the technical issues have been solved. We are glad to have you here. Maybe you have kind of already mentioned the peer review process in the discussion, and I would like to discuss a bit more about this. So and basically, nowadays it's common practice that after the submission of a manuscript, it is pre-selected by the editor of a journal first, and then sent to 3 experts usually who peer review the manuscript and recommend it for publication or suggest alterations and further experiments and so on. And so to paraphrase Churchill on democracy on this, actually, is the current peer review process the worst system except for all the others? What do you think? Is this a good way to do things, or could we do better?
I guess I can say a couple of things about that. Essentially, I think sometimes that the will of the luck of your viewers that you get sometimes when you see on a paper. And part of the
I'm
problem,
sorry, Christina. I think we are not hearing you very well. I think all the others have the same issue, right? Yeah, maybe the mic is not the best. Sorry. I don't know if you can do anything about this, but I could not understand you.
how about now?
Yes. Yeah,
It's
that's
that,
better.
maybe I just have to speak very close. I was just saying that I think a lot of the time you're at the beck and call of the peer reviewers that you're given. So often it's quite a game of luck. And essentially, if you're a good peer reviewer, often I've had the experience where they have maybe a different background and they provide a lot of great insight from experiments that I didn't even think of. And that's the kind of review. I really think that it can be super productive and make a paper better. But oftentimes it's not always the case. You get just people that are quite picky or argumentative, maybe because they're in too similar a field to yourself, and there's some competition there, or there's some other kind of bias that's going on, some competition that drives that. I'm not quite, but I think it's really challenging to balance a good review. Like you want to be critical, but you also want to provide productive advice. I think that and maybe it would be useful for the journals to really have really good pools of experts. And I think sometimes they're not quite good at pairing people with different experts. I know this is quite difficult because this is essentially free time labor for the rest of us who peer review often. I hope you could hear that.
Move on. Okay, we will be. Thank you very much for discussing the first part. Also, due to time, we will now be moving on to the second, to the Q&A. Sorry, so we might have some questions from the participants. Maya is asking, speaking about positive results, don't you think that scientists themselves choose not to publish a negative result, not just because a negative result is not exciting enough, but because they feel that they have not found the true effect that might be there? There are much more ways not to find a true effect than to find it. Erica is nodding, yes.
Well, I've certainly from scientists I know, one of the things that I've heard when people talk about negative results is again, it comes down to the fact that the things that will advance you are things that are considered novel and interesting. So there is some self-selection there, and actually, you know, anybody who's done experiments knows that there's only a certain number of hours in the day. So if you get a negative result, people say, well, why don't you just publish the negative result? And I think the point is often to really validate that negative result and do a real thorough analysis of it to prove, not to prove, but to give us a huge amount of confidence that it's negative would take a lot of effort. And so what normally happens is people will devote a significant amount of time to establishing whether a positive result they see is correct. Whereas a negative result, they think, well, it's probably not working. And there's a law of diminishing returns to spend more and more time to say, how much time do you want to keep spending to be absolutely certain that this thing didn't work? And normally people say, they'll move on, unless the negative nature of that is a critical question. Most of the time, people will move on to something that looks more promising. So I think it's not just a question of choosing not to publish a negative result. It's choosing not to do as thorough a set of experiments that really show something's negative, when it's easier to just try something new and hope for a positive. And that's what I've heard from a number of scientists, that's a kind of that's not just science, that's just kind of how life works in general to some extent.
Great.
Can I say something also about
Yes,
that?
of course.
I think, there is an element of personal philosophy in this. What you could ask each individual scientist, what is their own publication philosophy? And I think not everybody is trying to publish the maximum number of papers in the maximum number of high impact journals. So there are a number of interesting concepts that go alongside this, publication philosophy. One is that I've heard of is the so-called minimum publishable unit. And that suggests that the philosophy is you do a body of work, you have a variety of experiments that are focused on the same hypothesis. Some of them are positive, some are negative. And so one philosophy is that you divide up that body of work in a field that's, coherent in its own self. And you publish it in a lot of little salami-sliced sections of minimal publishable units. That way, you get the maximum number of papers, but you may not make the maximum impact, and your reputation amongst more critical scientists might go down because of that. And then another philosophy is to not publish, because then you keep it quiet and you've got it inside your own area, and you wait until you've got a lot of related work and you put it into one really big paper. So it comes out as a kind of magnum opus, great impact. And that used to be the case. For example, I remember when I was a student, there was a scientist, Hugh Huxley, who worked on muscle, and he published this massive paper, which was completely dominant in the field, solved a lot of the problems. And many of us greatly admired this. So we were sort of tilting more in the line towards the lines of waiting until you've got a body of work that will publish, that will make a big impact. But it basically all boils down to whether your goal in life, if you like, as well as being a scientist, is it to have a low profile, not make too many waves, and be appreciated by the people who've just noticed that you're doing good work? Or is your goal to have a high profile, make a lot of noise, and then have a lot of people who may be less critical acknowledge you? So I think, and it may depend where you are. Obviously, if you're young and you have published 0 papers, then one goal would be to publish at least 1 or 2 to get started. Whereas if you're more established and you've published lots of papers, you may feel that you've only got 24 hours in the day and you're going to spend them either doing experiments or writing up results. And actually, I've noticed that one of the interesting things that's happened in the last 6 months is many scientists have stopped doing experiments and they're at home and they're catching up with papers that they perhaps ought to have written before. Maybe it's a senior professor and, a student has written a paper, given it to them, and they haven't really read it and given their input and response to it. But my understanding is that the number of papers being submitted has actually gone up, even though people are not in their labs. So I don't think it's so easy to come up with. The advice depends on the person wishing to have the advice or the person giving the advice. Sorry.
Okay, great. Thank you for the opinion. Also welcome, Carissa. We are very happy that you are able to join now, and we will just have one more question from the first part of the discussion, and then we'll move on to the second part. So the question is how you think peer review procedure could be optimized. For example, make the single blind review. I think it's maybe blind review the other way around. Hide the identity of authors to make it less biased, and reveal the identity of reviewers to show they are responsible for their comments. So I guess this is blind review and transparent review. Is that practical? What do you think?
I mean, I can just say something. Or Erica, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm sure Richard has probably more to say with this. I mean, there certainly are experiments ongoing around this. I mean, there are experiments around peer review with, revealing the authors, trying to blinding the authors, trying to reveal the reviewers. Some of the issues are it's pretty hard to write a paper without people doing the detective work to figure out who the authors are, unless you kind of mask a lot of stuff, including who they're referencing, the public, in the public and the bibliography. But in terms of reviewers, I mean, I think that this is a really interesting question about reviewers not, being known, being out there, being more public, which certainly is being done in a number of places. I think that I personally think that it's a good thing personally, but I know there's some issues and some concerns, particularly with younger scientists, about can they be so critical of someone that's more senior in their field that might have, again, an effect over their career, and would they dare say something that's negative? So there is some concern with revealing reviewers in that situation. I think, I personally think, and I think a lot of the things that we think about at our journal is about transparency, and that is actually the way to go. But I know that there's some concerns in that way. But there are experiments being done where people are looking to see this. And Richard, I'm sure, knows more about this than I do, since he's more in depth.
Well, I was just going to say much the same thing. I mean, I kind of welcome transparency, but I am very concerned about. I think we want to involve early career researchers, and we want to involve more people in the process from the global south, underrepresented areas. And I think, I joked with somebody about this, that before we start revealing the identities of people at the bottom of a power structure, we should all go and talk to some sociologists. Because one of the things that I have found when I have spoken with people about revealing the identities of reviewers, there's a very, very clear difference in how they respond. If you talk to tenured, relatively old and white men, they say, it's fine, what's a problem? And then if you talk to young, untenured, black and ethnic minority people, they say, I don't want to do this. There might be some repercussions. And my big worry is that a lot of the discussion about the kind of bad behavior focuses on we could stop people behaving badly, but the scientific career structure is very, very unique in that you can be in a position where somebody can wield power over you for decades that you wouldn't even know. So you could give a bad peer review of somebody, and 15 years later they may be in a position to say, we shouldn't give this person tenure, we shouldn't give this person a prize, and you never know whether that will happen. And I worry that it sits in the back of people's minds. So I think if we do move forward towards transparency reviews, we have to be very, very careful, and we have to understand that there is this situation where you worry that for years and years and years this person could wield power over you because people stay in the same field, and that doesn't happen in other places. If you work in a bank and then you go and get a job in a different city in a different bank, your previous boss is probably never going to affect what happens. But if you can move around the world in science, and you probably, by the time you've done your postdoc, you're probably in the same field. So the people you're criticizing are potentially going to be in a position where they can affect what happens to you for a long time. So I think we just have to be really careful about that aspect. And you know, and I know Erica and SUB think about this sort of thing all the time, but I think some people don't. People don't think enough about the fact that you don't know what somebody would have said if they had had more kind of confidence about anonymity. And that's a really difficult question. I'm afraid I don't have an answer, but I think we have to think very carefully about it. I mean, just to add one other thing, one thing that Erica also said was identifying people. I know there are lots of calls for double-blind review, but my worry there, as Erica says, it's particularly in biomedical science, is it's so difficult to do, particularly somebody who has a history in the field. I mean, I'm thinking of for the LMB, for where Richard's from, and somebody says, we discovered the structure of ATP synthase, then you immediately know who that is. And you also have a situation where by blinding some people, famous people will be identifiable from their reference list and their pedigree, and other people won't. So does it actually create more of an inequity? And I also tend to think that the kind of detective work that Erica talked about is only going to get easier and easier. Will computational means to identify authors is going to just become easier. So it feels like it's not a path worth going down, because the path is just going to get harder and harder.
Yes, yeah, I think a lot of people. I was going to say a lot of journals allow, or there's an echo, someone else's microphone coming through, but a lot of journals allow, they have a variable policy, which is that they perhaps encourage referees to allow their name to be declared publicly, but they always ask for the permission to do that. And so that would be one area where, let's say, I mean, a young person might, if they've found a genuine mistake in a paper from a more senior established person, they might be proud of that fact because they've noticed something that had been missed by someone else. And so they may get a benefit from being critical. And just like when you in a seminar, you ask a question and it turns out that the presenter hasn't thought of that yet. And it may well be that it uncovers a whole new area of research, actually. So the whole essence of the scientific debate, whether it's through referees or through questions and answers in meetings, is to try to encourage people to be open so you get to the truth earlier. But it does get caught up in careers and power structures. So I think having the option, an optional transparency declaration is quite a good compromise to it.
Yeah, definitely. I think this is quite a good conclusion for us to move on to the second part of the discussion. So I would ask Valik to take over now.
So the second part of today's panel discussion are the preprints. So just with a brief introduction, there are manuscripts posted online with an open access before peer review at the journal to expedite the release of scientific findings, since the peer review is often a lengthy process. And it allows scientific discovery to be publicly discussed, and it really speeds up the scientific progress, allowing others to start new investigation based on the preference results of what we currently see with the COVID-19 papers, for example. And very shortly with the history that initially it started from Archive, the successful preprint repository for physics, math, and related disciplines that came up in 1991. And to biology, it came only a bit later in 2013 with bioRxiv, and in 2019 with medRxiv. And during recent years, the number of preprints in biological science really increased. It became much more popular. But the first question would be why it's like this. So why this order? Why firstly preprints became more popular in the physics and precise sciences, and only more than a decade later it came to biology and medicine? What are your opinions about this?
Can I say one thing? So first, I came from physics originally, and generally speaking, if you look at papers that are published and cited, physics papers, although they may have a lot of impact, actually, most of them don't actually get very many citations. Whereas if you're in biology, particularly if you're in medical research, let's say cancer or something like that, then the papers do get a lot of publicity. They're widely read, they're circulated, they get a lot of citations. So I think the reason why physics was the first is that it's not a backwater. It's just that there are fewer people, fewer citations, and they were the first ones to realize they could amplify their work by loading them up onto the archive before having it published in PhysRev Review or something like that. But then later on, as the biologists discovered that it would often take a year to get your paper through the refereeing and editing process in Nature or Science, they thought they're going to lose priority. And so therefore they then started to put it in a preprint form at the same time, they submit it to the journal and they put it on bioRxiv. And then the rules have been developed such that most of the journals now allow you to, previously, they said there was a block on advertising your work until the journal has accepted it. So you weren't supposed to advertise it or publish it elsewhere. But now there is a tolerance on the part of the journals, even the ones that are inundated with papers and only publish 5 or 10% of the submissions. They're tolerating it. So I think we've now reached a stage where many people in the biological sciences are putting anything of wide interest into bioRxiv and then simultaneously something into paper. And I think it's simply to do the size of the field and what impact they made before they were doing that.
Okay, thank you. There anybody want to add something?
Yeah, this is not directly related to your question, but it seems like we've seen in the past few months that the downside of bioRxiv, where CNN and BBC are running huge worldwide stories based on bioRxiv papers, and I think it's hard for even scientists to distinguish if the bioRxiv paper is correct or incorrect. And then if you just have someone from the general public reading CNN, something's going to get even worse with COVID or something. It makes it really hard. So I wonder if there's a way to somehow control the dissemination to the general public news and the press releases and so forth.
Well, so let me jump in there. I think there's two issues there. I think there's definitely a concern about dissemination of information to the general public and how this is handled and how this is examined. And I think we need to educate people about how scientific research moves forward and the nature of proof. That's absolutely critical, and COVID-19 has shone a light on that. Where I would disagree is that this is in any way unique to preprints. I mean, I sort of joked recently with somebody that I keep being asked about the dangers of COVID-19 preprints, but actually most of the stories I've been hearing about COVID-19 research is research from in journals. So if you think of the hydroxychloroquine studies from France, that was published in a journal. If you think of the two big Surgisphere studies, which were completely sort of non-existent data, that happened in a journal. So I don't think there's anything unique to preprints here. What we need to do is educate journalists and the general public about how research proceeds. And so you say, if I've got 5 people and it looks like they got better when I gave them hydroxychloroquine, that is not the same as a randomized controlled trial. And the observational study of those 5 patients could be in a preprint, it could be in some minor epidemiology journal, and the randomized controlled trial of something like dexamethasone came out first on medRxiv as a preprint. And so when that preprint was out saying that dexamethasone is working in a randomized controlled trial, that was much better than any of the published information in journals about this anecdotal observational studies of hydroxychloroquine, which had become standard of care. So I think I think that you make a really important point, but I think it's a general point about scientific information rather than preprints in particular.
Yeah, well, I don't know. I don't think you can just say they're on even footing, the unpeer-reviewed and peer-reviewed. Otherwise, why would we bother to have peer review?
No, I'm not. I don't mean they're on even footing, because the other advantage, and this is what I mean by education, is that bear in mind that the preprint comes with a big sign at the front that says this has not been peer reviewed. It should not be used to guide clinical practice.
Yeah, and in the newspaper articles in CNN they run, this is not peer reviewed. They have a huge section saying that, but that tends to be. I don't think the general public can really. They don't really know what peer review is and how to distinguish between reviewed and non-reviewed. I do wonder if there should be a way to limit what goes to the press from
well, I think it should. I think that's a responsibility of journalists. But I mean, as I say, I think of the French studies of hydroxychloroquine that were in a journal, and that peer review process took something like 36 hours, and most people basically don't believe that any meaningful peer review happened. So I think the problem is that we have this binary notion of peer reviewed and unpeer reviewed.
That's true.
But actually, the reality is we have unpeer reviewed, and then a huge spectrum that varies from the kind of responsible approach that the journal that Erica would oversee in molecular biology Cell takes, to a whole bunch of things which a lot of the time aren't really worth the paper they're written on. And I think so. We just have to live with that world, and I think that the solution is to educate people about the different types of information and what has and hasn't been shown and what has and hasn't been vetted.
Okay, thank you so much. So basically, the discussion itself slowly drew to the next question that I wanted to ask, but still there is some part that's left unanswered. So what are the pros and cons of the preprints, and does the speed cost the accuracy and proofreading? And what if this huge speed up and the scientific discovery publication could lead to a wrong way? And the wrong way, I mean the fact that all the further investigation that could base on the unproofread data could be just a blind branch that leads to the wrong way of investigation. So, Christina?
If my mic works. Okay, so I think there are definitely some advantages of publishing in a preprint, because you can really disseminate your work quite quickly. It's a good way for, like, maybe if you're in a very competitive field, to get your work seen. And in fact, I want to use this as a way to search for journals who actually published the paper. We were contacted by editors specifically through bioRxiv, reading the article. I thought that was kind of good, because then you could actually say, maybe this is a good fit for this particular journal. These people are quite interested in this work. But yes, of course, it comes with, like you were saying, some challenges as well. So you have some work that maybe a peer reviewer would say is not suitable for publication, or needs a lot of improvement or further experimentation, then you run the risk of some people maybe reading into the results and the findings. So certainly, I think that I think actually bioRxiv is becoming so popular lately. Even it itself, people are sharing a lot of major articles on Twitter from bioRxiv, and it seems that getting a lot of people even want to cite it. So a little bit tricky whether or not we should, put it all out there in a very rapid manner, or hold these results until the peer review. It's a bit of a balance here as well.
Can I say one thing then? and that is depending on where you're doing your work. You may be in a small lab with not too many colleagues, or in a big lab with lots of people. And so one of the things that I've always done is actually you write the paper yourself, and then you never quite know whether you've missed some key fact, or there's a wrong assumption underlying what you've written. So I have always given essentially preprints, but a draft of the paper to close colleagues, either in the same lab or now by email, or you can do it anywhere in the world, to people who you know are experts. So you're basically getting your own paper reviewed by people whose opinion you value before you submit it to the journal. And I know other people, so there are two sides to this. One is it improves the paper, but it does the same function that Valentin might have been asking about, which is the purpose of the preprint, perhaps, is to distill and get in criticism before it reaches the journal. But there are two sides to that. One is you're doing it for a good reason, and you're trying to make the paper better. But I know there are other people publishing work, and they know it's weak, so they want to essentially rub off all the rough edges of the paper to make it more acceptable. And so I've been hit both ways. In other words, a paper comes in, it's basically good work, and the criticisms that are given and make the paper much better. And then it's a great paper, it gets published, it goes straight through the journals. But I've also seen the situation where a paper arrives, somebody sends it to you and asks for your opinion about this work, and basically it's rubbish. So rather than saying this paper is rubbish, should never be published, you say it's rubbish for the following reasons. And I have been bitten more than once. The people I've given these criticisms to, in which the underlying emphasis was, don't publish this, it's bad paper. Rather than doing that, they've taken the criticisms and used it to hide, massage, or polish the weak parts of it to make it look better. And then they send it to a journal like Nature, which doesn't always have very good referees, and it goes straight through. So you've basically helped publish a bad paper in a good journal by giving them criticism. So now my own view is that if I get a paper to give an opinion on, which could be a bioRxiv paper, or it could have just been sent by email, is first decide, is this paper basically a good paper or a bad paper? And then you can give different style of comments depending on which way you think it should go. But I think, that's an individual scientist taking responsibility for it. But that's no different from people reading what they see on the bioRxiv and having a purpose for putting it there. So I think the value that Valentin was asking about in terms of what is the value of pre-publication in a bioRxiv, you could also get around it by picking maybe 5 or even 10 colleagues and asking them to read it. Of course, you have to persuade them to read it, because it's work reading it. It takes an hour or two, and particularly to give comments. But that's a skill, persuading people to do things for you that they might not otherwise do. Whereas bioRxiv, you only get people who are interested in it. Anyway, that's another angle on it.
I also wonder if, when you submit a paper to bioRxiv, and then, like, should there be a policy of editors to allow citations of bioRxiv or not? Because there's an issue where if you're a young scientist, you want to get the word out on your paper, and you submit it to bioRxiv, but then you get scooped, and then someone publishes before you in a legitimate journal, and say you published in 2020 or 2021 in the real journal, but your competitor publishes in 2020, but you published in bioRxiv in, say, 2019, for example. Who gets credited with the first publication? And so I don't think there's much uniformity now on if in legitimate journals, if you should be forced to cite bioRxiv or not be forced to cite bioRxiv because it's not peer reviewed.
I think many journals do allow you to cite bioRxiv publications. So then it would be a question of what the author wants to do or what the journal wants to do.
Yeah, I mean, I would just add on the citation thing. This comes up a little bit, and there have been some arguments from some people that somehow you shouldn't cite a bioRxiv paper because it's not peer reviewed, and I think that's as Richard said, I think it should be up to the author, because the key thing here is to mention that a citation is not necessarily an endorsement, and that we already cite lots of things that are not peer reviewed. So we already cite books, we already cite editorials, we already cite letters in journals. Most of those things are not peer reviewed, and it's interesting.
Yeah, but it's different with bioRxiv because it's much more widespread. I think it's different than citing a website, and it carries a lot more weight. I think.
Well, I mean, I can give you an example. I mean, so Colesbury.
Yeah, you can give me an example, but like circling back to your last question about this with the newspaper articles, you can cherry pick one example, but I think like you have to think about the whole picture. Like with the newspaper articles, like you can have one journal that's a bad apple, but I think in general most of the journals are doing good peer review.
Okay, but my point is, I think it's an important example. So the most cited thing ever in Google Scholar was not peer reviewed. And I know that because the thing that's most cited in Google Scholar is the molecular cloning manual of molecular biology that we published, that was written by Joe Sambrook and Tom Maniatis. That is a lab manual that was not peer reviewed, and it's more cited than anything. So I think the point that something has to be peer reviewed to have some kind of validity is illustrated by that wasn't peer reviewed. So I think we just need to understand that a citation is a link to something, and it's not an endorsement. It's not inherently an endorsement. It depends on the claim made by the author, and that should be based on the understanding. I mean, I can think of entire fields of research that are disparaged in published journals, and because back to the point, they're not 15 years ago, 20 years ago, that was what's thought. It's wrong. We don't retract anywhere near the number of papers that ought to be by the definition of a citation as an endorsement. The other point I want to make is I think there's a real problem with the notion that somehow preprints are against peer review. I think it's really important to make clear that what preprints are doing is they're decoupling the review from the dissemination. They're not saying that peer review shouldn't happen. And actually, one of our aspirations with bioRxiv is that it should make peer review better, because we ought to make, back to the Churchill quote, is this the least worst situation that we have to review papers, or are there ways in which peer review could be better? Could we involve more people, there being more ongoing? So I don't want anybody to think that as an advocate for preprints, I'm somehow against peer review. I mean, I have been for many years a journal editor and still editor of some of our journals. So it's about decoupling the two things.
Okay, thank you for the pretty intense discussion. And now I suggest we should go to the Q&A session. And we have several questions from the audience. And the first question is from Nina Dini. For people who are new to the field, especially PhDs and postdocs in your labs, how do you efficiently find people who you can trust to get feedback on your data and model without having the fear being scooped? I think a lot of young scientists fear the latter, and this creates a vicious cycle of impeded growth. How would you advise to tackle this problem?
Well, one thing. So as a CEO of a scientific society, I'll put a plug in for networking and joining societies. I mean, a lot of what goes on in science are trust relationships. You wind up, building up colleagues. You wind up finding people that can help you. And as you move further in your career, you have more and more of this network and connection. And that's true in a lot of fields, but definitely true in science. And I think the question is, how do you not give up the fear of being scooped, that you have to build relationships with people. You know, it comes from your lab, it comes from other labs, it comes from going. Right now, of course, most of it, I mean, unfortunately, I'm in my basement instead of Germany. We can't travel right now to do a lot, but you still, it's like basically you have to build up that network, you have to meet other people, and then have to build up that trust that allows you to have colleagues that you can feel like you can share things with. I mean, I think that's like outside of journal. That's actually more about what you're doing in your career. And yes, you have the relationship like, okay, what if we put it on bioRxiv? Am I going to get feedback back? My understanding, Richard could confirm this, is that a lot of the, you don't see a lot of public commenting on bioRxiv, that a lot of it seems to be done through direct emails and things like that when people put it out. So that does go on in places where maybe you cannot network personally with people, but it's basically comes back to, you do actually have to build human relationships. This is not all data analytics and things that go out into the sphere and happen without having human touch to it. So I would just encourage people to think about how do you network with others so you can build trust and get those colleagues that can help. And yeah, it takes time, but hopefully your advisor can help you with this. You're in a lab, you're not all by yourself. Hopefully you have someone that can give mentorship. I know that's not always the case, but that's kind of like the ideal, I feel like, here.
I can say one thing, and that is, how you decide to go about this does depend on your judgment and whether you trust people. And so there are lots of game theorists who are experts in this human behavior thing. So there's this, for example, a prisoner's dilemma. Is it an advantage or a disadvantage to trust someone and collaborate? And so, I've had some experience of this. When I was younger, I used to tell everybody everything, and there were two responses. One type of person would never believe you because they wouldn't realize you could possibly be telling them the truth. They didn't trust you at all. The second type was people who remained silent, took it away, and then rushed to include it in their own paper. So they were dishonest, basically. They weren't being open. So my original idea was you should trust people, give them a chance to show whether they're trustworthy or not. And then if they defaulted on that, when I was very young, I used to give them all a second chance. But now I recommend people only to give people one chance. And then if they show they're untrustworthy, you do what is one of the solutions in the prisoner's dilemma. You do what's called tit for tat response. In other words, you begin by trusting people. But if they show they're untrustworthy, then you respond in like by not trusting them again. So this has nothing to do, particularly with who you find to give you an opinion and referee your paper, but it is basically to do with what lots of other people in lots of other walks of life. It's the same problem. So I think you can learn from, and there are lots of books about it as well. So I think that I recommend looking more broadly than just the how it impacts on science and how you go about getting your papers to be read and criticized by people. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And we have one more question from Citi. According to you, does publishing manuscripts as preprints adds to the profile of PhD student in terms of job opportunities, both in academia and industry? So what do you think about this?
I think in this case, something like bioRxiv is good because normally if you're going for a job and you have a paper that's submitted but not reviewed, I would say most committees, at least ones I sit on, tend to ignore that or be like, okay, we don't know if this is true or not true, really. But if it's on bioRxiv, then you can see it and download it and everything, and it's more legitimate, I think. So I think in that case, you could put them on bioRxiv, and then it helps. It's not the same as a peer-reviewed paper, but it's better than just saying submitted.
I think it's. I would endorse. I think it's for your recent work. An example of your recent work, it's important. I think Rockefeller announced recently that for their hiring, they're encouraging applicants to include bioarchive papers. And I think because of the time course of a student position or a postdoc, you can take a couple of years to get into a journal sometimes. So your recent work, it's really important. I mean, I think that it isn't peer reviewed. And so if you have a candidate who has 5 bioarchive papers, and you have another candidate who has 4 cell papers and 1 bioarchive paper, then I think everybody's going to have their own kind of, there's some history to this person. This candidate kind of looks a bit better. So I think the important thing, particularly for a student or a postdoc, is it shows what you've been doing recently, because as was said, it's something that's there, and they can download and they can make a judgment. It's an evidence of productivity, but you have to, as always with preprints, somebody has to go and read it themselves and check it. You can't take it on trust.
Okay, thank you. So then the last question for this part of the session is from Seving. Does bioarchive give an author a timestamp? Can one claim that they were first one to have the right to publish in a peer-reviewed journal just because they were first published on the bioarchive? What do you think, Christina?
So I definitely think that there's a time because it goes on live. But in terms of the rights to publish in a journal, I mean, it doesn't automatically give you a right to publish in a journal, of course. I think depending on which journal you choose to submit your paper to, they may all have different criteria. And there, as we spoke before about the different reasons that they may want to publish certain types of articles. So, I mean, I think that publishing in a pre-print format is useful if you have a close competitor and you're trying maybe to be the first to do something very novel. I think it is a useful strategy. At least someone can go to the preprint and see, okay, that person had put it up on this date, and it's there for all to see. That's about that.
Okay, thank you. Does anybody have something to add? Okay, then we can proceed to the next part.
Thank you, Valek. We now move on to the last leg of our discussion, where we talk about the road to open access. So Plan S is an initiative by the European Commission, the ERC, and other national funding organizations, the aim of which is to make all research funded by public and private grants provided by national, regional, or international councils openly available without embargo. The Alliance of German Organizations announced Project Deal, which aims to make all research by authors at German universities open access immediately. This took effort from the 1st of August 2020. Now, these are all great systemic changes to pave the way for open access. So my question is, how do you see these changes affecting the publishing industry? Maybe Erica could start us off.
Sure. Yeah, I'm really glad to start this because I think that, first, so I come from a scientific society. We are a nonprofit organization. So I always like to say that means that we are not a no-profit organization. We just act in a nonprofit way, which means we give our profits back to enrich the people that it comes from, the scientific community. So our mission is really about allowing our scientists to share their research. So it very much supports open access of research. We want science to be shared. That being said, like many journals out there that are commercial, we do derive excess revenue from our publication. So we make more money on our publication than it costs to run the publication, like many commercial publishers do. And what we do with all of that money is we put it back into efforts like professional development for young scientists, efforts to increase diversity, equity, and inclusion in the society, efforts to advocate for science funding within the United States. So, we're benefiting the societies, the scientific society writ large. And so I think it's really important when we think about open access, that is really good, but that there are complex business models. And one of the things that happens right now, what we don't want to do is move to open access journals that then burden researchers. We don't want to move it so that then researchers, particularly when we think about researchers that might be and the southern parts of the globe, where this will be a particular burden more than it is within the US and Europe, where there is stronger funding for science. We don't want to shift a burden onto researchers. So the question is how the money moves through the system. I'm more familiar with the US than Europe. In the US, the libraries pay for it. It supports the libraries, that comes from universities, and it's supported at indirect costs that come from grants. So the money in the system is going in through the federal, mostly federal, some private, in through universities, and then back out into journals. And so that's who's helping support. If we suddenly shift and say, well, now researchers have to do that, then we need to think about how do we shift the money and how do we, continue what happens then with library support, what happens with all of this in the system. And I understand, with PlanUs, a lot of it is about lowering costs overall in publication. And they're like, well, why should, if I'm paying for a publication, should I pay for all this advocacy and professional development and things like that? And I think that that is a fair enough thing. Again, I think that that's a perfectly reasonable argument, and I get that. But I also say, one of the reasons a lot of societies and things have kept their dues low is because we have this other money coming in. So scientists get artificially low at rates for their professional development. Scientific meetings often are at a discount. There are a lot of places where we discount things because we have this other support. So the question is, how do we kind of think about what activities are important for being done in the nonprofit world? And then how, do we find value to continue to support these? And I think, of course, I have a bias. I come from a scientific society, so I think they are important. I think that we contribute a lot back, to the scientific community. And I think that we need to think about, well, how does that get supported out of the federal structures and out of the university structures? Because it does help the universities if we are advocating to get more research dollars. That helps support universities. It does help if we're helping to improve the profession of scientists that are inside their sphere. So what I would say is I'm very much supportive of it, but I do think we have to think about not moving that burden directly onto researchers. And one of the things that we're trying with our journal, we're experimenting this year, is subscribe to open model, in which we're hoping to get enough libraries that then go into a scheme, they get a discount. We open the journal if a certain percentage opt in. So money continues flowing the same way it's flowing now, but it allows us to open. We'd like to move to a full open access, but this is sort of a staged approach that we're doing right now. So my perspective as a scientific society, I think it's super important we open up, but I also think doing it without thinking about how the money flows is and not thinking about what other value we're getting out of that is going to be detrimental overall.
Yeah, can I add something? And that is, if you kind of step back and take an overview of research as well as publication, we've done this for many years actually in our lab in Cambridge, and that is, if you look at the cost of an institution or a department in terms of the grants that it gets in compared to the number of papers, it turns out that the cost of each, if you say the publication is the end result because it's knowledge and it's publicized, it turns out it's between, say, 100 and 200,000 euros per publication. And then you can ask, well, what is the publication costs? If it's open access and you're paying up front, whether your institute or your funding agency or your personal grant pays for it, it's usually £1,000 or £2,000. And that includes all the refereeing, all the publishing, distribution, archiving it for 100 years or say maybe 300 years. Many of the old journals, that say Royal Society, they've all been digitized. They're all open access now. So it's about 1% of the cost of research is in publication. And actually, I think that's fine. I mean, it could even be 2% because it's still a very small proportion. And part of the duty of research is to make sure people know what the result of all that expenditure, all those hours of work, the salaries, the consumables, all the equipment that have been bought, the 100 to 150,000 or 200,000 euros per publication. It's a lot of money, actually. So that's like maybe 1 or 2 person years of work, including all the overheads, management and equipment and so on. So I think the general balance of how much it costs to publicize, publish and distribute and have it on the web and so on, compared to the cost of the actual research, isn't bad. So then it comes down to how do you do that? And I know that some of the funding agencies, for example, Wellcome Trust, Howard Hughes, MRC that pays us in Cambridge, Max Planck in Germany, they have all adopted the highest standard of openness. In other words, they want it to be accessible for nothing to a researcher, say in the middle South Africa or South America, where they don't have much money. They should be able to read all of the papers. And so they've said that this is part of your duty as a scientist to do this. And they say your grant includes the money you need to make it open access. So I think that that is a good idea to have it. Of course, it doesn't say how that general support, funding, and doesn't say which journals should get the money and how they should get the money. It just means that it's there and it's a good idea because you have to publicize it. And I mean, there are journals like, I would say, Nature and Science, which devote quite a lot of their income that they get from selling the journal, not just to the primary publications, but they have commentaries, news and views. They have reporters that spend weeks of their lives going around the world interviewing people to get to the bottom of something that hasn't been published yet. So there are journals that mix primary publication with commentary, and they often have a lot of readers, 100 and 200,000 or so circulation. And so people want to publish there because it's a long set. So that's one model. And then the other model is the society journals, who often have extremely capable, rigorous reviewers. And some of them, for example, I know the one I know, International Union of Crystallography, they have about 6 or 12 journals, and they are actually a publisher as well as being a society, and they have a lot of income from that. So when you go to the meetings, are quite well funded, they're well supported. And so these are just two business models, but they're both using the fact that there is a general idea that a proportion of the money used for research should be spent on publishing, but exactly how it should be governed and distributed and who should be in control of it, I think that needs to be commented more on by Erica and the other Richard.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned the cost there, Richard, because this is an opportunity to sort of, people talk a lot about Plan S. I actually wrote an article with Michael Eisen and my colleague John Ingalls about a proposal we had come up with called Plan U to get around some of the issues that Erica mentioned. So as Richard says, the cost of publishing is about 1% of the cost of the research. Now, the cost of posting a preprint is about 1% of the cost of publishing. So our view was that the economics that Erica talked about are complex, and it's difficult to know how to fund these things. Just simply kind of switching from a subscriber to an author may not work for everybody. How does that affect the Global South, etc.? So our proposal was that basically to say, look, if it costs hundreds of thousands of dollars to do the research, it costs thousands of dollars to do the formal publication, it costs tens of dollars to do the preprint. The simplest scenario is just for all funders to mandate posting preprints so that the information is out there and free and anybody can read it, anybody can post. And then let's have a discussion about how we fund peer review and what's the most equitable way to do that. But we can do that safe in the knowledge that we've got all the information out there as a preprint, because that costs a vanishingly small amount per paper, because what people often don't realize is that most of the costs incurred in publishing are salary costs, the cost of administering peer review and things like that. That's what makes, it's to the credit of people like PNAS and eLife that they put their numbers out there. And I think eLife's numbers are $5,000 a paper, roughly. That's what it costs them to do. But a lot of that is to do with salaries, because you've got to, it doesn't just, you need people to chase referees, you need to have kind of experienced people behind the scenes. So I think that the key is to work out how we fund that type of thing. And my view is that will become easier if we take the dissemination part out of it and do that separately.
And has Plan U been adopted?
Well, so Plan U has essentially been adopted by I think the Michael J. Fox Foundation, Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, and ASAP, the other Parkinson's disease foundations. They are all mandating it. I gave a talk to the MRC leaders last year to try and persuade MRC to do it. I don't know if Fiona Watt and her colleagues are still thinking about that, but it was well received. I mean, it's the advantage is it's simple, and as we say in that PLOS biology paper, you could literally do it tomorrow. You could do it tomorrow, and then have the conversation about the more complicated nature of trying to get the peer review and the formal certification and evaluation of articles, and what that looked like, and how basically journals or whatever those things become would be funded.
Would anyone like to add anything to that, or maybe we move on to the next question? We're kind of on time right now, but if you are all okay with it, maybe we could go on for a few minutes more.
Yeah, I'm fine.
Okay, great. So I think you touched upon this topic about putting the burden of open access on developing countries. Maybe we could talk about that a bit, since a lot of us who are pursuing our PhDs or masters in developing countries, what we have is Sci-Hub to gain access to literature. How do you see us include developing nations in the open access initiative, and what systemic changes would be needed there? Maybe you could start us off, Carissa.
Yeah, I think a bunch of my funding comes from NIH, and there you're required to put everything online for free through the NIH server. I think it's a PubMed. So in my opinion, that's good, and they do enforce that very rigorously, where you literally don't get your funding. They don't send you the money if you're missing even one paper each year when you do your annual progress report. So I think that's one place to start, and also obviously things like bioRxiv are a great resource as well.
Could I ask a question rather than trying to answer it?
Go ahead.
I haven't tried working in a lab, for example, in Mozambique or Congo or South Africa. I know people from there, but what are the barriers that are experienced? Is there a survey to find out? So why can't they just with their mobile phones get access to PDB files and bioRxiv?
I wouldn't know a lot about that. I did my bachelor's in India, and a lot of articles there were not accessible to me in general. So the university itself was not paying for it. They did not have the access to pay to journals and subscribe to journals. And there, the only option you get is Sci-Hub.
All right. Okay.
So there is, I mean, depending on how you define the developing world, there is a WHO initiative called HINARI, by which many publishers make content completely free to countries in the developing world. And I know there's some cutoff to do with GDP or something like that. So I don't know what the criteria are, but I know that a lot of very poor countries get all of this free anyway. I think some of the challenges is if you've got a country which has a slightly higher GDP, so it doesn't qualify for HINARI access, but the university itself doesn't feel that it can afford a subscription. But I mean, as Erica pointed out, the challenge is then those people in those sorts of institutes will find it a challenge if they don't have subscription access to content, but they may potentially find it's also a challenge in finding the $2,500 to pay publication costs if that's not included in their grant award.
I can just add something briefly to that. Essentially, one maybe comment for those who have trouble accessing articles is sometimes it helps to just email the corresponding author. I think most people are very happy to share, their article with you. And it may provide an opportunity for you to even start a dialogue and ask a question about the article. So that's one thing. Another thing is that I noticed a lot of the institutes, even EMBL included, they have initiated open access policies. So within 1 year of publication, most of our articles, they have to be published open access. And I think that a lot of the journals, as far as I can tell, are allowing this. It's either a 6 or 1 month embargo period. So I don't know if that helps, because maybe you want an immediate action. Certainly helps in the long term.
Okay, moving on. Despite these systemic changes, there is a fragmentation of scientific content, as majority of literature is still behind paywalls, and no one publisher has access to it without fulfilling all legalities. However, in a scenario where one publisher with the funds to secure a majority of full text links, invest in data hosting, and function as a collaborative platform, do you think this would lead to a monopoly situation in the open access market? And how would this affect smaller open access journals? Anyone who would like to kick us off?
So I can make a few comments on that. I mean, I think, there is right now a lot. I mean, one of the aspects of open access is that the way publishers can make money is by volume. So high volume, I mean, if you look at most of the groups that do open access, a lot of them have a high volume journal in which they're publishing a lot of things, and that helps to generate things that allow them to have more selective journals. There is, how much will people be willing to spend on article charges kind of question. And the more you do peer review and the fewer you publish out of that means that you have higher costs with, less volume out, less cost coming into it. Again, going back to the economics, there's some complex economics that drive certain behaviors in the journal. And one of them is to have a larger journal. So that's one thing. So how many small, kind of open access journals are sustainable in the larger marketplace will be fascinating to see as things move forward. But I think that the other question about, if in this magic, this new world, there's like some sort of big place where everybody publishes, is that a monopoly? And I think that's a completely different kind of thing, which is actually kind of interesting. And it's one of the things that we're looking at right now. I mean, we have just received funding from Wellcome Trust and HHMI to be able to do a curatorial experiment. We're partnering with bioRxiv, and Richard is aware of this. And it's around curation. It's for like, okay, if we were looking at the, journals are about curation. We package things up and we say, here, this is good stuff from our journal. You trust our journal. We're packaging it. It's a curatorial mode in a lot of different ways. And so we're looking at, can we separate that from journals? Can we go out and look at bioRxiv and other journals that are not our own and our journal and highlight, cell biology literature and say, well, this is really, here is the literature that we value regardless of the journal. And we're going to be doing an experiment and exploring that. This has been done in other places. None of it is quite completely caught on. So we're looking at it again. And I do think that there's potential to be, it would be great if scientific publication was in some ways like a utility. Everybody could get their paper out, and that's just a piece of the process. And then journals and groups come in and curate it. And I saw that there was a question on the side about, can we just do that by like search functions? And yes and no. I mean, I'm a big believer that, and maybe because at one point in time I was in a museum, I'm kind of a believer in curation. I think that it's all well and good to have a Google search result, but it's also, very nice to have people that kind of can select and have that knowledge base that help people that are especially new to the field find their way through the literature. But I do think that there's some interesting opportunity that we need to think about, where we maybe think about looking at the body of literature writ large and curating it in different ways to help people access. Maybe here's the curation for someone new in the field. Here's the curation on this very specific area. And what that looks like in the future, I'm not quite sure, but I think that the experiments need to be done, and we're quite interested in doing them.
Would anyone like to add to that maybe? Okay, then the next question is, Most scientists still judge a scientific article by the journal it was published in and the impact factor. We do have other metrics coming in, like the altmetric score, but they still don't have that much traction. How do we change this mindset, and how do we realize open access at an individual scale as scientists and as PhDs, postdocs, or new group leaders? Maybe Christina, you could start off.
So being a new group leader, I understand that you do need to make a name for yourself and definitely become a little bit more well-known through public platforms like Twitter and things that I kind of reluctantly joined. But I think, dissemination of articles through these preprint platforms are useful. In terms of their metrics, though, the alt metric, I don't know if it will take off, because what I've come to learn about platforms like Twitter is that it's sort of a self-fulfilling loop. So it seems that people promote a little bit themselves, which I think is fine to get your work out there, particularly amongst your peers. But at the same time, I'm not sure how much weight that will hold in saying whether or not a publication is of significant quality. So that's sort of my view on that.
Go ahead.
So if I can just put a plug in here for if people are not familiar with the group DORA, or the Declaration on Research Assessment, this is a group that actually is housed within ASCB. And it came out of the work in the biomedical sciences. So this is a group, their website is sfdora.org, that's looking at research assessment and trying to reform research assessment to kind of get beyond. Originally, it was sort of all about getting beyond the impact factor, but it's actually grown quite, broader than that, and is really looking and helping institutions think about how to assess the things that they value. Because organizations often say, well, we value good work, we want to value being a good colleague, we want to value good teaching, and then they look and say, well, what's the impact factor? It's like, which doesn't measure any of that. So it's really about trying to help institutions think through these things and think about, and they're starting to develop, by looking at case studies, processes that they've seen other institutions do this successfully. There's still a lot of work to be done, but I would encourage people to definitely, if you're interested in this issue, to look at DORA. Look at what's there. There's pretty active blogging and webinars around this subject, so you can really get in deep, and it's a good resource for the community.
Would anyone like to add to the answers by Christina and Eka? Okay, then moving on to the final question. Do you see subscription journals becoming obsolete one day? And if so, how far are we from reaching that stage? Maybe you could start, Carissa.
That's a tough question. It does seem like there's like I used to really enjoy going into the library and browsing through a real journal, which I think is really missing in today's push to more and more online. I wonder if some of these journals or distribution systems could have a For You page, like on TikTok, where it's more like a browsing experience instead of a targeted search. But I don't know. I personally hope they don't go away, but I think they probably will. But I don't know.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
Yeah, maybe I should say something. Was when I was a student, which is about 50 years ago now. Sorry. Yeah. I had an advisor, Brian Hartley, who said, I asked him, have you read this paper that came out in journal Nature? And he said, I never read the journals. If something important happens, somebody will tell me. So unfortunately, since then, which was reading the journals on a Saturday morning in the library, because there was no other way of doing it, times have changed now. People have stopped having reprints. It's only PDF files now. And then there's all these social networks that probably is more popular amongst the younger rather than the older generation. And one recent experience I had is I'm walking from my office to have coffee, where you meet actual real people and talk to them. and I passed through a terminal room where people are doing molecular graphics, and one of the people says, "Oh," he said, have you seen Twitter this morning? There's a great new paper published there." And of course, it was only a link to a real paper. But there are lots of different ways now of exchanging information compared to, and so you can't really predict. We have various things like LinkedIn, ResearchGate, which are obviously their business model is to try to suck you in, like Facebook or Twitter. And then probably they're hoping they'll be bought out, and the people who created the information exchange network, that's their model, is how they're going to earn their money and become rich one day. So I don't think you can look into the future and predict it. But I think, yesterday I went to one of the old colleges in Cambridge, and they have a library there with books that go back to 1,200 years, and they're very valuable books. They've got them locked up with burglar alarms. So there are books before printing, there are printed books, there are first editions, there are libraries, there are PDF files. So I think all of these things are going to be maintained, but exactly how it will evolve in the future, I don't think you can possibly predict. And everybody has to vote with their feet. And obviously, if you're overwhelmed with information, you're not going to even bother with any of them. You're going to wait for someone to tell you because it's going the rounds, and it's a topic of excited discussion in the coffee shop or in the coffee room. So I think we're in a very fortunate position where, I remember 30, 40 years ago, even the radio and the TV programs, they had hardly any science in it. But now the newspapers, TV, they're stuffed with science, actually. So everybody who's talking about events, they often know quite a lot about climate change. They know quite a lot about the COVID-19 and so on. So I think we're in a much more favorable situation as scientists in the world today than people were a while ago. And so I think we should celebrate the diversity, but you still have to decide how you're going to spend your own time. You can ignore the literature and just get on with your work, and then possibly make a bigger impact because you're not spending quite so much time. Whereas there are other people that act as a kind of hub for information exchange, and they may well find their role in life. They will be the editors of Nature or something like that in the future. And all of these different styles are needed. So I think it's a great benefit to have all these different possible new fora for exchanging information.
I think it comes, there's a certain aspect when the question was specific about subscription journals, but as Richard was saying and Erica saying earlier about the budgets, what we're talking about here is kind of filtering and context. So this conversation is much, much bigger than just scientific publishing. You look, Facebook and Google make money out of ads and by trying to be all the information. That's the strategy for ResearchGate, that's the strategy for academia.edu. On the other hand, and so, I will get certain information from Twitter, and you hope that Twitter will exist, whatever its business model is, and there's some doubts about that. But on the other hand, I have a subscription to the New York Times. I don't feel that's going to go away. The Guardian has a different model to the New York Times. There's some debate about whether the Guardian's model is sustainable. So it's kind of, it is difficult. And I guess the question is, we don't know how everybody's become very accustomed to getting stuff for free online. And the question is whether that's going to continue. And if it doesn't continue, to what extent does the consumption of scientific information fall into the general trends? Is there a New York Times for science? Are you in a situation where people value paying for the filtering process that somebody provides? I was at a publishing meeting a few years ago and was talking with Phil Campbell when he was editor-in-chief of Nature, and I sort of joked with him. I said, do you think we're going to be in a position where it used to be a badge of honor to be published in Nature, but if everything goes online and is on something like bioRxiv, does that mean that the badge of honor becomes being highlighted in Nature, and maybe Nature writes some news and views about a paper on bioRxiv, and the career currency for the scientist becomes the fact that somebody wrote a news and views in Nature about a paper on bioarchive. So you can go and read the paper on bioarchive for free, but essentially what Nature is now doing is journalism, and maybe to read the context, you have to go and pay to go to Nature. So maybe the sorts of things that are in the back end of Nature are open and no longer under subscription control. But I find it hard to imagine that you're going to be able to sustain the kind of sort of news engine that somewhere like Nature or Science is without getting money from somewhere. And people always kind of say advertising. I just don't think there's enough money in that for our business. So that's going to be interesting to see, because as Erica pointed out, you look at the front of Nature, you look at all those people and all the people that they employ. That's why it's tens of thousands of dollars to publish a paper in Nature, because they've got to pay the salaries of all those people.
Any additions, Christina or Erica? Okay, with that, we come to the end of our panel discussion. I'm very grateful you all could join and make the time for this. It was very interesting and we could go on for a longer time, but unfortunately we're out of time. Thank you very, very much. We have a poster session going on right now. You could all hop over to Zoom in case you're interested in seeing some posters. And I would like to invite everyone to Horizon Sunrise tomorrow. It's a social event. You can chill, bring beers, food, cocktails, coffee, whatever you're having at that point of time in your time zone. And maybe we can all talk science and all the problems we're facing in lab, how we're handling COVID. It would be great to see a lot of you there. Thank you very, very much again. And I hope I see some of you during the Meet the Organizers session. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.